So this is a tutorial on how to do the granny stripes stitch pattern specifically for a blanket for the Granny Love Crochet Along. I am using a double knit acrylic yarn for the yarn that I'm using. I'm using a 4.5mm Clover and More hook. These are my favourite hooks. And a pair of yarn snips, but scissors will work just fine. And then a large blunt needle. They're called lots of different things: tapestry needles, darning needles, yarn needles, widely available in craft shops. So that's everything you need to make this blanket. So to start your Granny Stripes blanket, you're going to need to make a starting chain that is the width that you want your blanket to be. I have a tip here that means you don't need to count that chain. You just crochet it to how long you want it to be, and the way that I do my slip knot means that you can undo that slip knot and undo your chain back to where your last stitch is of your first row. So this means you don't actually have to count your chains. If you do want to count your chains, your starting chain needs to be a multiple of 3 plus 1. So for example, it would be a multiple of 3, say 3 times 10 is 30, plus 1 is 31. Doesn't matter how big your chain is, it needs to be a multiple of 3 plus 1. Or follow this way of doing a starting chain and you don't have to worry about counting long chains ever again. So I'm putting my hook to one side of the working yarn and pulling out. Then I'm rotating 360 degrees. And that twist there is what I use instead of a slip knot. So if I pinch that twist, I can now do my starting chain. And your starting chain needs to be the width that you want your Granny Stripes blanket to be. So I'm not going to worry too much about what the actual count of my chain is. I just want it slightly bigger than I want the width of my blanket to be. So that will do for this swatch. So I'm just going to give it a quick count. Obviously you don't need to do this if you're doing a long chain. So I've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 16. So I've actually got the right number of chains here, so a multiple of 3 plus 1. So I'm going to do 2 extras just so I can show you that unpicking at the end. Right, so for Granny Stripes, we do those granny groups just like we do in a granny square, but we do them back and forth in rows. So in the 4th chain from my hook, I'm going to make a granny group of 3 double crochets. So when you go into your chains, it doesn't really matter whether you go under 1 thread or 2. It is personal preference. I prefer to go under 2. So I'm just going to make 3 double crochet into that 4th chain from my hook. There we are. So you can see I've kind of got a group of 4 because I've got this bit of chain that sticks out here. So now I'm going to skip the next 2 chains and I'm going to do 3 double crochet into, so I'm skipping that one, I'm doing 3 double crochet into that chain there. So you're going to work 3 double crochet into every 3rd chain. So you've got 2 chains between each group of 3 double crochet. And you're going to keep doing that until you get to the end of your chain, leaving a little bit of your chain left over so that we can unpick it. So I'm going to keep doing this all the way down my chain. This first row is a little bit more fiddly than the rest of the rows of the Granny Stripe. The rest of the rows work up quite quickly. So I'm just going to do a couple more granny groups until we get to somewhere near the end of the chain, and then I'll come back and show you how to undo this chain and start your next row. Okay, so this is what my first row looks like. You can see I've done 5 granny groups. I've got this bit of a starting chain over here, and you can see I've got this overhang of 2 chains. So what I'm going to do is let me just take my work off of my hook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that chain there. So if I take a yarn needle and pull on that thread there, pull that tail through, that's undone that chain there. And then what I'm going to do is, you could keep undoing chains if you needed to. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to tighten that up. So there's a bit of a knot there. And that's how you start a blanket in rows without counting your chain. So to start round 2 of our blanket, oh, I'm losing that loop there. So to start round 2, I'm going to start with a chain of 2. I did try doing this with a chain of 3 to start with, and I found it too baggy, but if you're a tight crocheter or you do your chains tightly, do 3 here instead of 2, but for me 2 is fine. So now I'm going to flip my work, because when we work in rows we always work 1 row from the back and then we go back the other side in rows. I've got 1, 2 there. So we're going to be working in the spaces just like with a granny square. So I'm going to be working in this space here, so I'm going to do a granny group in each of these spaces along here until we get to the last space. So we're doing our granny group of 3 double crochets into each space along, and then I will meet you back at the end of this row and show you how we finish off the other side of this row. So I've done a few more granny groups into the spaces along, and I'm now near the end of the row. So if you remember, we had this bit of chain that was sort of stuck out at the side. So we're going to do our last group of 3 into that chain loop there. So we'll do 3 double crochets into this loop here. So there we are, that is the end of row 2. So if you weren't changing colours at all in your blanket, you were using the same colour, you would repeat this. So you would chain 2, turn your work, and then work a granny group in each space along. Your last space is that chain 2 from the last round there, where your last granny group would be. But I'm going to show you how to change colours at the end of a row and also in the middle of a row, because I'm going to be doing a scrappy version of this blanket. So I'm going to have sort of colour changes mid-row and at the end of the row. Okay, so I've cut my end, and this is one way of changing colours. There are many ways of changing colours in crochet. So the way that I'm going to do it for these scrappy granny stripes is I'm going to take my hook off of that loop there, and then I'm going to put my hook into under those 2 loops there, and then I'm going to put my next colour yarn over the top of my hook, and then I'm going to pull a loop through those 2 strands we just put our hook in, and then now I've done this, I'm going to give that yarn tail a gentle pull to undo that last stitch there. So you can see I've sort of transitioned to the next colour. So you could tie those 2 yarn ends there together if you wanted to. I don't like knots in my work, so what I would usually do is sort of wrap them together like that and then weave the ends in. So I'm now going to chain 2 with my new colour, and then I can continue working across my row just as I did with the last colour. So I'm going to do a group of 3 double crochet into each space along, and my last space is that space just there. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do a bit more of the next row, and then I'll show you how I change colour mid-row. Okay, so here I am partway through a row, and I'm wanting to change colours because I'm maybe at the end of my scrappy ball of yarn that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work the next double crochet but stop before I do the last pull through. So this is another way of changing colours in yarn that I'm showing you. You can of course mix and match or do your own way. So you can see here I've worked 1 full double crochet, and then the next one I've done a partial double crochet. I've still got 2 loops left on my hook. So I'm going to take my next colour and pull up the end. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my yarn just like I would if I was starting a new row. And I'm going to yarn over and just pull up a loop of the next colour. I've not even cut the last colour yet. So you could again tie those 2 strands together in a knot, but I tend not to do that. I just overlap them and then weave them in securely. So now I can continue my granny stripes in the new colour, and you can see that I've done a colour change mid-row. So the reason why that loop is coming loose is because that end is not secured to anything. So like I said, I do go back and weave my ends in almost as I go when I do a project like this. So yeah, that is how to do a granny stripe, how to change colours at the end of the row, and how to change colours mid-row. I'm really excited to see my scrappy blanket come together. So let me know in the comments if you're going to be doing a granny stripes blanket or a giant granny square blanket for the Granny Love crochet along.